All right, well, welcome everyone and good morning. Bienvenido e como mai. This is how we say welcome in our native languages, both Joy's and mine. This is setting the table for equitable participation. So if that title resonates with you, you're in the right place. And I'm glad that you're here today. I will say that before we get started, because we do have the luxury of a Zoom meeting format today instead of a webinar, we would love to see your faces. And we also acknowledge that you may have signed up for a webinar hoping that you could be off camera. So whatever makes you most comfortable, it means a lot to us to be able to see who's in the room. So if you are willing, we'd love to have you turn your camera on, but it is totally up to you. So I'm just going to get started with introducing Connected Realities, the firm that Joy and I are with, as well as ourselves. Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for turning on your camera for us. So Joy and I are with a small firm called Connected Realities, and we really see our mission as helping teams and communities to create collaborative solutions that are born from a deep understanding of each person's uniqueness, as well as our shared connectedness. We're both planners, and we find that our work in the world through planning or other community development work really shows up the best when we have that deep understanding of each individual and we're finding our shared interconnectedness. So I'll briefly introduce myself. I'll hand it over to Joy. I'm Le'Alani Boykin. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a process designer. I'm a community planner, facilitator, and trainer. I'm native to Hawaii, or the Hawaiian Islands. I got higher educated at CU and UCD, so I'm quite familiar with Colorado's higher education system. I've primarily worked for and in the outdoor recreation, stewardship, and capacity building fields, both in Colorado and in New York City. Back in Colorado, thankfully, and now I'm focusing entirely on organizational capacity building and community engagement with Connected Realities. So I will have Joy introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone, and I echo Le'Alani's invitation to have you all join us via video if you are able and willing. I am the founder of Connected Realities. I was a community planner for the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program of the National Park Service for nearly 18 years. And then in 2016, decided to take a different path into consulting so that I could more fully sort of occupy my place in the world a little bit more and focus on different kinds of projects. My background, my educational background, Le'Alani and I have actually the same educational path and early career path, even though we came through them a decade apart. I have my undergrad degree is in environmental design from University of Colorado in Boulder, and my master's is in urban and regional planning from University of Colorado at Denver. And I just think that there's a lot of really important work to do in the world. And so we are about helping communities and teams figure out how to work together as well as they can so that they can do the great work they're trying to do in the world.
Thanks, Joy. Just a little bit more on our work. So we know that we're capable of so much more as humans when we're working together and bringing out the best in each other. And we really do believe that helping people work together more effectively and move from shared problems toward shared solutions is what we need to be doing in this world. And so we do that through a number of ways, through training, like sessions like these, through facilitation and group process, through planning, primarily strategic planning for organizations, but also community planning efforts and community engagement. So our intention today is to share with you some of what we know, some of like the best of what we know from our experience, right, related to facilitating equitable public participation. And in this session title, we're talking about setting the table. But what is this table that we speak of? This is both the literal and symbolic table that represents the meetings and the processes that we lead as planners. And it's the gathering space where this discussion, this deliberation, and decision-making take place. So that's our table. And I'll just briefly touch on what we have in store for you today. We want you to be able to differentiate between processes that are diverse, inclusive, equitable, and transformative, explore common barriers to equitable participation, understand how they're created, and identify tools to eliminate those barriers, particularly understanding core human needs and how they can impact our behavior and our processes and what we can do to address them. What this session isn't about is, it's not about like the latest engagement tools. We don't have an app, we don't have like that killer technique, but we do have a mindset that we can offer you. This is all about applying an equity lens to participation. And this session may seem totally straightforward for you, or it could be challenging. I mean, that's fair. Striving for equity is so difficult on so many levels, personally, professionally, and systemically. So you just may encounter some discomfort during this session, and I just want to ask you to step into that, because that is part of the process of, it certainly has been part of my process and Joy's process of learning and growth and truly connecting with people. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Joy.
And let me just say that part of how we do training and discussions is it's very discussion based. It's also very interactive. And so for those of you who are not on camera, we will in this session at 2 different times be breaking up into small groups. And so I think that what happens is that when you go into small groups, you are on camera, or maybe, no, it doesn't automatically do that.
But it makes the conversation maybe a little more.
It does make the conversation easier to have when you can see your colleagues. So if any of you need to make any quick last minute preparations for being on camera, feel free to adjust your space or your hair or whatever you need to do accordingly so that you can contribute in your small breakouts. I'm going to take screen sharing over for a moment. And do we see the one screen with, okay, so we are starting with some questions. Let me readjust my screens for a moment. Okay, so we've got some questions for you. We want to know from your perspective, what does diversity mean in meetings and processes? What does inclusion mean? And what does equity mean in meetings and processes? And so we're going to explore these answers in a few different ways. First, I'd like you to take just a minute to, there are many of us who are internal processors and need a little bit of time to think about these questions on our own before we send you into small groups. So just take a minute to jot down some notes about your answers to these questions on your own. And then we're going to break you up into groups of about 3. And I want you to come up with a collective answer to these questions. So here in just a minute, I think Leilani is going to be our Zoom guru and send us into small groups.
Do you want me to send folks into their groups right now, or have a minute for folks to?
Let's just wait a few more seconds.
Okay. Sounds good.
So you'll just be in those groups for about 5 minutes to come up with your answers to these questions. And then we'll talk about some of your answers when we come back.
Okay, so those rooms are opening up.
So I got sent to a group, which means that there may be one too few people in a group because I came back out of it.
My bad.
Thank you for sending the questions.
I think partners are okay, huh?
Yeah.
Not joined. Sarah needs to move. To Libertarians. Okay. And Laura, if you can hear us, I think there's a breakout room that you can click on to join. Oh, actually, you will be by yourself, so I'm going to move you. Oh, shucks. I think, did Laura? I think Laura signed off. I did not start a timer.
Okay, so let's call that a minute in groups. Give them 4 more minutes. So is that a 1 minute countdown?
Yeah. So,
So bring them back in 3 minutes. Shall I start a timer?
I've got one going. Thank you. I'm going to eat a little more breakfast then. Unless we're not floating this time, are we?
No.
Okay. Oh my gosh, we're still recording.
Huh.
Okay. Hi, Suzanne. Do you need me to put you in a room? You should have an invitation for room 2.
Lonnie, how many rooms are there?
Say again.
How many breakout rooms are there?
There are 7 that are full of people.
Okay.
We've got 2 minutes left. I'll bring them back in a minute. I'll hit the button in a minute. Welcome back, Erin and Michelle.
Leilani, has the countdown timer started for the?
Yes, we've got 10 seconds left.
Okay.
Hi, Sarah. Good to see you this morning.
Okay, welcome back. I like it for those few moments that you come back before you put your video on mute again. It's nice to see folks, it really is. So I'd like to hear a little bit from you about what you came up with in your discussions about the answers to these questions. So would somebody please share with me what you came up with for the answer to the first question? What does diversity mean in meetings and processes? And you're not, there's no test, there's no quiz, just tell us what you're thinking.
I was in a group with Caitlin Long, and she had a great definition. I don't want to put her on the spot, but
We can
you know,
ask.
What's that?
Sure. I was going to say we can ask Caitlin if she'd be willing to share.
Where did you mean for diversity or inclusion, Jen?
For both, actually, but you know, I feel like you really captured what I was trying to describe for diversity. If you don't mind sharing.
Sure. I think what I said, sorry, I've only had one cup of coffee so far. I think what I had said was that diversity in public participation in meetings is having representation from a wide cross-section of the different people who live and work in the community. And then inclusion is the ability to access the opportunities to participate and make their voices heard and felt within those public processes. And we had some audio and technical difficulties at first, so we didn't quite get to equity, but that's where we got to.
All right, thank you for sharing that.
Does
anybody have any definitions that are significantly different than those two for diversity and inclusion, or have another layer to add?
Pete and I were in a group together, and for diversity, we talked about understanding the demographics of the community, and diversity being a way of looking at how representative your processes are of the community overall, not just in terms of some more obvious dimensions of diversity, but also different types of opinions and thoughts and lived experiences and backgrounds.
Yeah, thank you for that. How about equity? What kinds of definitions did you come up with? What does equity mean in planning meetings and processes to you?
Well, I can share just, equity in a meeting session of making sure that whoever's there has the ability to participate and be heard. So part of that's, making sure facilitators anticipate maybe someone that doesn't have the ability or initiative to speak out or participate, and to encourage people that are there to chime in.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Anybody have anything different about equity or another layer to add?
Sometimes in order for there to be equity, you have to be a little restrictive, in a public hearing setting, making sure that everybody, has the same amount of time to participate. When you're taking public testimony or something, everybody gets 3 minutes. And so you need to think about, so that you know, the time that you have to discuss a matter is equally distributed, to add on to what Pete had said.
Thank
That
you.
everybody knows when they show up that they're going to have their time, and the time is equal.
Everybody will have access.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else?
I would just add to when thinking about equity and just making sure that you're weighing opinions with equity in mind, or not opinions, but information that you've gathered, people's thoughts about, you know, whatever they're expressing, their opinions, their feelings. So when you're going into the recommendations phase, after you've gathered information, that you're keeping equity in mind and representing, you know, all the voices that you've heard, and making sure you're not just going with the easy solution or the vocal minority or vocal majority, but you're actually sort of engaging the information that you've gathered from everyone through your, you know, expression of diversity, and making sure that everyone's included, not leaving that out as you're making recommendations and taking action. That is something that I feel like is more representative of equity sometimes, than just making sure everyone's at the table. It's really showing them that you followed through with listening.
And engaging a diversity of perspectives and opinions, and making sure that they're represented.
So it's not just in the input gathering, it's in the decision-making process. That's what I'm hearing.
Correct. And so sometimes, you know, that you have a good decision if not everybody's happy, you know, everybody didn't get what they, you know, wanted, that everybody got a little something and left something behind.
And everybody was thoughtfully considered, right? Like we didn't just push ahead without a full understanding of the fullness of the experiences, the needs, perspectives. So what you're sharing sounds pretty consistent with the way that we define these things as well. I'll share our definitions. And let me just adjust my screen a little bit again. Okay, so within the context of planning, the way that we have been defining things is we define diversity as the state of being that is characterized by variety, right? Like diversity among people is the reality in most of the communities that we work with, right? There's variety in terms of race and socioeconomic class and age and ability, national origin, languages spoken, religion, sexual orientation, gender expression, all of those kinds of things. And as you all say, like diversity in terms of thoughts and perspectives and needs. There's a wide variety of people and perspectives out there. So that's just the natural state of being. And then, you know, in my years as a planner, it's not always been my experience that the composition of most of the meetings that I have facilitated or been a part of, or processes, are taking that they are necessarily representative of the diversity of the context that we're working within, especially in my 18 years in the fields of recreation and conservation. So because of this experience, we work really hard to achieve inclusion, which we define as the composition of people in meetings and process, a situation where the composition of meetings and of people in meetings and processes reflects the diversity of the context the meetings are taking place within. So all those different kinds of people I mentioned in that last slide, all that diversity is reflected at the table when we are prioritizing inclusion. And then equity is, it's not guaranteed just because you get everybody to the table, right? Just because we have achieved a situation where there is a diversity of people and we've gotten to, you know, inclusion, we're not necessarily at a place where everybody has equitable access to the conversation, to participating in decision-making, to having their voices be heard and acknowledged and sort of folded together. I have this imagery of like when you go to an ice cream shop, like a cold slab kind of place, and you know they're putting everything together and mixing it all up, right? Just because they're at the table doesn't mean it's all been folded in together. So we're going to dig in a little bit deeper to what we mean by equitable access to the table and how we create that and what gets in the way. And Alani is going to start by highlighting one of the biggest things that gets in our way, which is related to our own perceptions.
Thank you, Joy. So I'm going to walk you all through a model that we've created based on what we, oops, I just got a little click happy there. That really illustrates how to understand why individuals on a team or in a community may often see things differently. And this idea of the Tower of Perception was adopted by us from David Gray's work in The Pyramid of Belief, as well as Chris Argyris's work in The Ladder of Inference. Not sure if folks know those models out there, but they're fantastic. And we just put a little more on it, given our experience and how we, what has helped us to understand why things are happening, why folks are coming from the places they are. So everyone has their own Tower of Perception, and we've identified multiple levels that both shape how we view the world, each one of us, and consequently how we behave and how we work with others. But before we can talk about the actual tower, we've got to talk about its context. So we call it reality with a capital R. This represents the truth of the whole world, everyone's truth all at once, if you will. It's the comprehensive veracity of every experience on Earth. And then there's our little piece of reality, our pin on the global map and small slice of real estate that we're building our towers on. And even though our view is just one tiny fraction of that vast expanse that represents the greater reality, it serves as the foundation with which we're building up our perceptions and behavior. Like that's what we're working with. That's our piece of real estate that we get to build upon. So the first level of the tower represents our historic experiences. So this reflects the history of the people who raised us or had influence on us. And that includes how they lived, where and how they grew up, and their major life highlights and challenges. And because they raised us, of course, this inevitably becomes a part of our history. So as we continue to climb up this tower, we get to social identities, which Joy had brought up a little earlier in her description of diversity, that there's so many different identities out there based on gender, race, religion, or age. And these are critical pieces of our identity that influence how we perceive what's around us and what happens to us. Then we've got lived experience. I think, Rebecca, you had mentioned lived experience. So we each have our unique catalog of experiences, where we went to school, where we currently live or previously lived. Do we have kids or not? Do we live in the city or the country? These are the experiences of our lives. So these three levels, historic experiences, social identities, and lived experience, all these combine to shape our motivation. And you know that even people with the same historic experiences, social identities, and lived experiences, they aren't necessarily motivated by the same things. Like my sister and I, we're practically identical. We both grew up in the same household. We've got the same lineage. We look similar. We both identify as women. We both play volleyball, went to the same high school, but our motivations are so different. She's motivated to build a family that includes a spouse and children. She's a serious provider and nurturer, whereas I was motivated to build a family that includes just my partner. And since she's bugging me right now, this little kitten right here. So I'm a bit of an attention hog. So there's plenty of child that I bring into the relationship, but we don't need kids. Like that's just unnecessary for us. So on the Tower of Assumptions, or on the tower, Next is assumptions. So with all that information that we're getting from these lower levels, it can be really overwhelming to know what to do with all of it. So of course we have to narrow our attention and only take in bits and pieces of what we're sensing. And because we still need to make sense of all of that, we start to add meaning to what we are observing, and we have to make assumptions. If we didn't make assumptions, we'd go nuts. We would be completely overwhelmed. So it's biologically crucial that we make assumptions. However, when they go unchecked, we easily develop beliefs about people, places, and things. And this is the territory where things are accepted or considered to be utterly true in our minds. And it's typically why we make certain decisions, why we hang out with certain people, why we associate with specific groups, why we take on hobbies or politics or religion. So then atop those beliefs are our needs, which we'll be getting into a little more later today. And everyone has a common set of core human needs that must be fulfilled in order for us to feel safe, to feel secure and comfortable. Arguably, you could put this at the bottom of the tower. Really doesn't matter how they stack up, just that they're all there. These are all elements that contribute to our perceptions and our behaviors. So once you reach the top of the tower, like this is your vantage point. This is where our individual reality originates. And we often become habituated into believing that everyone's reality is similar to our own. But of course, you all know that. I mean, you're planners and you've engaged a lot of different types of people and have had to bring those diverse opinions to try to find some kind of mutually beneficial solution. So you know that this is really what the map looks like. Everybody is standing on their own towers, and each of us is moving through our own versions of reality, which means that we're going to miss things. So because these towers show up like big time in our planning processes, and they influence what each person is thinking and doing, including us as planners, including us as facilitators. Yeah, we need to be very mindful of the complexity in the room. Alrighty, that's the end of my section. I will hand it over to you, Joy.
Thank you, Lenny. Am I off of mute? I can't tell yet. Must be.
We can, or I can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, so what's true for all of us is that because we're all on top of our own towers of perception, there are things outside of our awareness. And our intention in this session is to get all of us thinking about other people's experiences, things that we might not normally think about. So we make decisions, we design processes, we lead meetings that make sense to us based on our own filters. We're atop our own towers of perception. And it is probable that there are things that we're not considering based on other people's realities and their needs and their experiences. And so therefore, it's also probable that we are unintentionally creating barriers to participation. So to get us thinking a little bit more about this, we have an exercise. So when we do this session in person, we give you drawing tools and blank paper, and if you have anything around you to draw with, try it that way too. So you can answer these questions by writing them down, but we encourage you to think about drawing too, because it helps us access different parts of our brain, different parts of our thinking and feelings about issues. So so try that if you can. So we've got 4 questions for you, and we're going to use the example of, so we're going to put you into small groups again here in a little bit and get you to think about your answers to these questions, and we'll talk about them again. And we're going to use the example of a group of people who we don't think enough about in most meetings and planning processes. And this is a huge group of people, and I know there's a lot of diversity, but even then, we still don't think well enough about people with disabilities. That's the general category that we're going to think about as we go through this exercise. So here are the 4 questions. In what ways might a person's physical ability impact whether they come to a meeting? In what ways might a person's physical ability impact their experience in a meeting room, the physical room, or even the virtual room that you're in? In what ways might a person's physical ability impact their ability to participate in the meeting once they're there? And in what ways might a person's physical ability impact their interactions with meeting facilitators and other participants? So we are going to, let me back up a little bit. We're going to get, I'll tell you about those things in a moment. We're going to get you into groups again. You'll be in, Alani, will they be in the same groups or different groups?
I recreated them, so you'll get to meet new folks. And I also put in the chat box a link to this image so you can keep track of the questions, because our screen sharing goes away when you're in breakout rooms. So go ahead and click on that link so you can keep track of those questions.
So you'll have 7 minutes total in groups. So 6 minutes plus the 1 minute warning, I think is how it works in there, to come up with some answers to these questions. And we'll talk about them on the other side.
All righty. I'm opening up all rooms. Enjoy all.
I got sent to a room again, so it could be that somebody's not.
I anticipated that, so that room had a room of 4 with you included. Thank you. And Karen, if you can hear us, there's a breakout room invitation that you can click on.
Back, you all. I know that re-entry can be kind of abrupt, so I'm sorry if you were in the middle of a thought. Let's talk about some of your answers to some of these questions. So let's get a couple groups to tell me how you answered this first question, which was, in what ways might a person's physical ability impact whether they come to a meeting? What are some of the things you came up with?
Is my audio still working?
It is.
Having issues there. All right. A couple of years ago, I was able to do a citywide universal mobility study, which obviously brought folks with physical disabilities from all over the city to talk. One of the main issues, really, it's not about whether or not your building is accessible or whether or not your meeting room is accessible. I mean, those are all sort of givens. The issue is where's your city hall located? Where's the parking available located? And what are the barriers between that parking lot and the city building? We had a lot of folks with physical challenges that wanted to participate in civic meetings. The problem comes in is there's a lot of planning that goes from getting from your own apartment to the car, from the car across town, finding parking, getting yourself into the building. So in a lot of cases, folks that have these physical challenges aren't going to do that unless it's a critical issue that they really feel strongly about. And what we were talking about in our group is how Zoom and virtual meetings has really opened up that barrier so that we could get more public participation.
Thank you for that, Dawn. I appreciate that answer. Jeff, what did you all come up with?
Yeah, thanks. No one else was talking in the meeting with me, so I was there by myself. But I sort of thought about the car and how much time it takes to get into the car. I have an aunt who's disabled, and it can be a half-hour process, or maybe you have to hire a ride, or maybe you have to get someone to get, it can be very difficult versus getting to a computer and getting to Zoom. I think that there's a different set of people that, if people are experiencing physical challenges, Zoom is probably easier for them, or Microsoft Teams, so we can definitely reach a lot more people. If people have cognitive issues, it may be more difficult for them, So I think that there's this whole new online engagement really provides a new opportunity to reach new folks, and we also need to consider people in this new line that we may also be excluding.
Yeah, thank you. Right. So a lot of physical access kinds of things that we never think about, like those of us who don't have physical disabilities, there are a lot of barriers that we never even have to consider. What about how people find out about meetings? Did any of you talk about that topic in your little groups? Like, how do we reach out and let people know, and what might the barriers be when people have disabilities of various kinds?
Drew, go ahead.
I'll speak for my group. That we didn't have time to get to that question, but I will say that certainly one benefit to having all the glowing rectangles that we have in our lives now is that there are a lot of ways to divide that pie. Social media alone, is such a targeted and effective, efficient way to get the word out to the people who may most be affected or most be concerned with a particular topic or meeting. And so I guess my point here is that we've made a lot of progress in that, and technology certainly has been responsible for it.
One of the things that, even though I like the idea, the phrase, the glowing rectangles, one of the things that, an easy thing that I can think of that we are still not doing well is that often when we send out an announcement on social media, it's in the form of a JPEG with information in it. So our information is embedded in a JPEG, which is not accessible to screen readers. So there's a place where we're not thinking about different kinds of accessibility because we never have to think about it, right? So talk to me a little bit about what kinds of answers you came up to the question of, in what ways might a person's physical ability impact their experience of a meeting room? Maybe this is, a place where we're all a little more familiar with thinking about things, but talk to me about what happens once people get to the room. Go ahead, Rebecca.
The group was also having technical issues, so like Jeff, I was kind of alone in there. But a thought that I had there was, pre-pandemic, when we had full public meeting rooms, it was trying to visualize some of the rooms that we have, and it was often crowded. There are a lot of tables with a lot of poster boards and a lot of people milling around, and the height of the tables is, for someone of like an average height and seated at the table. And so just thinking about, like, when we ask people to like reach across the table and draw on maps or just navigate around different tables or different stations, that could be hard depending on the mobility limitations that somebody might have. And I think Jeff had mentioned like cognitive disabilities too, and like being in a crowd may not feel comfortable to certain people, depending on how large groups of people might impact them mentally or cognitively. So those are some thoughts that came to my mind on that question.
Thank you. Anyone else?
One
My
thing
group talked about, go ahead.
Sorry, I can't see who was speaking first. Alani, did you catch?
To Sarah and then Don.
Okay. My group talked about, we spoke a lot specifically about folks who may have visual impairments or maybe deaf or hard of hearing. So that really would impact, if someone's deaf or hard of hearing, like, we don't have the ability to do closed captions in real time in public meetings in most settings. I work for a municipality, like, we don't have that service. So like, if someone doesn't have an interpreter that they brought with them, they're pretty much excluded from participating in any of the conversations. And then again, with someone who may have a visual impairment, they might not be getting all the information because they can't see the presentation that you're showing, and they can't see different like charts and graphs, and they don't have the full information that people who have full sight and have full hearing get the ability to fully participate. And because of that, they don't have all the information to be able to participate effectively, even if they do have the ability to participate, which is like a piece of it as well. So
right, that's the difference between inclusion and equity, right? Like, do you actually have access to the conversation, to the information? Lani, who was it that was next?
One thing our group really talked about, I historically had a individual with ALS who regularly attended meetings and spoke out on things. And one of the big barriers is time limits. I know our particular jurisdiction puts time limits on public comment. Well, as you're losing your ability to speak, or maybe it takes a little longer to even write out what needs to be said, your 3-minute time limit is up just introducing yourself. And so being able to be aware of that and create reasonable accommodations so that all members of the public, get that accommodation to get their statements out.
Yeah, that's a case of like equal time does not necessarily mean equal access. It's a great point.
And a difference, also a good highlight of the difference between equitable and equal, right? For one person to say, that person couldn't say as much in 3 minutes as somebody else could. So just because they had equal time doesn't mean they had equitable access. A couple more things that, just so we'll move on to the next question. But a couple of the things that we've been thinking about lately are hearing issues. So I have pretty full hearing, but I do have a hard time, and I rely on people's lips a lot to confirm what I think they're saying. And when we're wearing masks, that is just so much harder for me. So it's really important that we use microphones in rooms, because, often we'll have people say, oh, I have a loud voice, it's okay. And then they'll speak louder, but that doesn't mean that everybody can hear them. So microphones are part of it. Scent sensitivity is something that I hadn't always thought a lot about, but there are people who have like migraines or other problems that are triggered by heavy scents, and sometimes we have to ask for spaces to be low or no scent spaces. And then there's just the physical maneuvering, right? Like, there are too many tables and chairs. Part of it is like, if you are using an assistive device of any kind, whether it's a wheelchair or a walker or crutches, can you get behind the tables and chairs when people have their chairs pulled out? So there are a lot of things to think about. Lani, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, for microphones, it's one thing to have the technology, it's another thing to know how to use it, to speak into the microphone. I know maybe some of us here, I mean, I needed to learn how to speak into the mic, but even our participants, like waving it around and you're not getting the audio. So even taking a moment to remind people you need to speak into the mic so that people can hear you.
Usually we have to remind people many times.
Yeah.
That's a difficult issue though, right? Because of what you were just talking about on the sensory side of things, because you may be impacting one person where they're able to hear better, and you may be impacting someone maybe with a TBI, a recent TBI, and you may be giving them a migraine, and maybe they're getting the overload of lights, and then maybe they're getting the overload of people talking, and then they get the overload of all of a sudden this loud noise coming out of there, and they're just like, screw this, I'm out of here. And so maybe a better way to do it is like just have an online website that people can go to and leave it open for a month and have everyone. We've done that on a recent project, and our levels of participation have gone up, and you can go through and you can make sure that all of the colors are not, for people who are colorblind and low sensory, and make sure that they're speech enabled and all this. You can have that happen in advance. And so maybe the online stuff is a great equalizer that allows people to come at their own time in their own way.
In some ways, I think that there's an argument to be made for that. And then in other ways, there are communities that are a lot less likely to participate if it's an online environment.
So there was, this has been kind of an ongoing thing. She's got this deal where your case is like the 5th address that's requested.
Oh, I think that
And
must not be about
at
us.
2 addresses, it should have.
Thank you.
I'll just, I know that this is off script, Joy, but I do wonder, like, let's say that you don't have the option of online, or you know that you'll be missing out on reaching a critical population if you only go the online route. What can you do in that in-person setting when there are so many different needs around, competing needs? Any ideas?
And part of it is like, we don't even know what the needs are. Sorry, go ahead, Shay.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was going to say with that, like, it could help a lot. You know, I think of like my grandfather who has a hearing aid. So when they use an intercom or a microphone, he can't hear it at all. And so using some kind of physical like board or, you know, written, writing up what people are saying, why they're saying it, can be really helpful.
Yeah, diversifying the ways that input is coming in. Pete, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I'm just, you know, with the whole hearing thing, and I have a pretty severe hearing impairment. I think for people to be able to hear, and with mass, I agree, it's hard to, you know, I think sometimes people need to see their mouths expressing what they're saying, but also some people are quiet in general, and if they have a physical impairment, they're even probably more precluded from participation. So part of that is the facilitation to make sure that if certain participants aren't being heard, to make sure that go around and see if they have the ability to express their opinions in equal format. I think is really important. You know, in physical meetings,
they're not being heard.
Yeah.
Oh no, I'm curious, Pete. How do you know that they're not being heard?
They sit there with a blank stare. You know, and especially in a busy, as Rebecca said, crowded room, the ability to hear is even more hindered. And certainly with mass, that even compounds that. In our council chambers, you know, we have an FM T-coil sound system, but that doesn't always work, or some people don't have the capabilities of having that dial into their hearing aids. I think remote meetings with, you know, headphones and things, it helps people a lot. But not everyone has the full technology to be able to participate in even remote meetings. So there's challenges all around with that.
No doubt.
So there are two things that this discussion has me thinking. One is there really isn't one way that's going to work for every person, right? Like, just about the time you think you've solved an issue for one person, it's created an issue for another person. So having multiple modes of engagement is really important if we really want to engage everybody. And then the second thing is related to how we, what was the second point? It'll come back to me. So it was how we engage people. Yes, I've forgotten the rest of that point. I will come back to it. I apologize for that. And let's move into this third question, which I think we're sort of talking a little bit about anyhow. In what ways might a person's physical ability impact their ability to participate in a meeting? We are talking about some of that a little bit. So I want to continue to hear what ideas you have around that. And I will also open up the fourth question. In what ways might a person's physical ability impact their interactions with meeting facilitators and participants? So what else are you all thinking?
I'll chime in quickly with a thought that I had that was related to the point that I made before, which is, you know, with regards to the outreach and marketing for you know, community engagement these days, you know, it really is critically important that we all keep in mind, you know, just some of these things are simple things that we can do to make sure that we're maximizing the accessibility of our tech. And, you know, when you're putting together a website or a web page, like making sure you have alt tags, like for the JPEGs, that may not be, text to speech, or you have readability. I mean, you need to have those alt tags there. There's really good automated functionality that is pretty recent on some of the social media that it can put subtitles, automatically generated subtitles on like videos or something like that. Just making sure you're enabling that all the time. It's little things, alt tags for web pages. I mean, that's been around forever, but it's something that, when a web developer is putting together a page, it's often overlooked as an afterthought. And we need to be extra careful that we're not, overlooking things like that.
Yeah. I remembered the point I was going to make. Drew, you helped me remember. So in terms of outreach, what I was thinking is, if we're committed to engaging everybody, then one of the things that we can do in outreach is to ask about what people's needs are related to participation. Do you have any requests? Do you have any needs? Do we need translation? Do we need childcare? Do we need interpretation? Do we need, what are the needs? So we don't have to try to design for, everybody. We can sort of try to understand our audience better before they even come to the room, so that we can do what we can to meet their needs in the space.
That's an excellent idea. Yeah, especially for a larger meeting. Yeah, that is something that we should be thinking about more.
But Alani, why don't we talk about needs? Oh, wait, no, not yet. I want to share one more slide with you all. And then Alani, let's talk about needs. So, we've been talking about the disability community in general, in very general terms. And that's just one group. We've been talking about the complexity of engaging this one group of people. And so, like, when we're trying to engage multiple different kinds of identities and lots of different kinds of people, these are some of the questions that Leilani and I and the rest of our team are thinking about when we're setting up meetings. So we're thinking about things like starting meetings by asking, when we do introductions, we ask for names and pronouns. So frequently we leave people out, or make assumptions about people that are wrong, because we're not making space for people to tell us about how they identify. We think about language access, so interpretation and translation, and we differentiate. Translation is the translation of the written word, interpretation is about the spoken word. And so language access means that things are announced and advertised in all relevant languages. We're trying to make sure that we have good simultaneous interpretation in all relevant languages during our meetings. Timing, it's things like, I don't know how we did this. I'm so ashamed of it, but Alani and I recently, this year, did a meeting with a youth group where we were in a different time zone than they were. And somehow we scheduled an evening meeting after school during dinner time, and we were remote, so we didn't provide a meal. It was the worst timing for young people. So we need to think about timing and things like meals. And people aren't going to be able to participate well if they're hungry. Physical access, we talked a little bit about in our discussion. Childcare. There's a phrase called economic harm offsets that was coined by our colleagues at Transformative Alliances based here in Denver. And it's the idea that for one person to participate in a meeting or a process might have a greater cost on them than it does for somebody else. So for example, some of us are able to participate in meetings because it's part of our jobs. And other people, maybe they have to travel to get there, and they're having to take time off of work and therefore not getting paid for that work. And so, we talk sometimes about stipends to get people to come to meetings, but economic harm offsets consider the fact that it's not the same cost for everybody to attend. And so how do we help to make it possible for more people to attend? And so these are just some of the things that we've been thinking about. What are the things are you thinking about related to making it possible for people to participate more equitably?
If I can just make a comment on the timing piece, I think it's important to not just have a single meeting for whatever different phases of a process you're in, and that multiple meetings across multiple different times might be more effective, so that you can capture people who maybe they are working all day and so they need to be able to attend an evening meeting, and that they're not able to attend something during the day. But then people who have kids at home, like you said, they're not able to attend something that's during dinner time. So maybe during the day tends to work better for them. Back to people with disabilities, if there's someone who relies on public transportation, but their route stops service after the evening rush hour, how are they going to get anywhere? Maybe they can arrive to the meeting, but then how are they supposed to get back home afterwards? And so being able to consider those different variables and accounting for potentially a few different meetings so that you can target different populations, different people for each of them, or having wider options like open houses where it's over a wider range of hours, but it's not necessarily a specific presentation. And that's something that I've used before to try to accommodate a wide variety of people.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Caitlin.
I think one thing on the language and access is that everything has to be language and accessible. So you can create a website and then the landing page is in English, and you have to get past that to be able to get to the Spanish portion. You're just going to leave any Spanish speaker at that first page not knowing anything what to do. On vice versa, you can get the landing page taken care of. You can get all the information taken care of, but then the survey, if the survey is only available in English, then they're not going to be able to get it. And if you're in an in-person meeting or a virtual meeting or no matter where, I mean, you're providing some interpretation at point of service, but then they go to the website and they're going to be dependent on Google Translate, which sometimes, you know, if you're talking about widening the shoulders of a road, they use the word just shoulders like for a human being, not the shoulder of a road. And so it doesn't always get it right. And so I just, I think, especially when it comes to language access, because that's something we're working on a lot in Boulder, is making sure that everything's accessible. And so I think from start to finish, and it's not just a one point, one stop moment, but the entire thing needs to be accessible.
In all relevant languages, right? And so
yeah, we're just doing Spanish now, but then yeah, next one, you know, what's the next most popular one? Yeah.
There is no official US language, which means that, you know, from where I stand, like what we ought to be doing is doing engagement and outreach in the languages of the diversity of the people who are in the communities that we're trying to reach and work with. And so I've been in at least one meeting where we were doing simultaneous interpretation in 4 different languages: Somali, French, English, and Spanish, all at once. And they do that for every one of their meetings. And so part of what, I'll let Lani get to her next section, and I'll just make this last point. Doing a good job of equitable engagement takes more pre-thought and a little bit more footwork, right? So just language access alone, you need a couple of weeks of lead time to translate documents. You know, if you're going to send anything out, it needs to be translated by somebody who knows what they're doing, right? Maybe somebody, Jeff, who speaks transportation language in addition to speaking, you know, whatever language, foreign language or other language you're trying to interpret or translate into. You know, like creating PowerPoints. I'm terrible at like still creating tweaking or finalizing my PowerPoints the day before an event, the night before an event. That doesn't give me time to translate things. Interpretation is something that you need to secure ahead of time, right? Like people's, the interpretation services out there, their calendars get full, right? Just finding people to do these kinds of things takes time. So it is our job as people who are planners, you know, dedicated to equitable engagement, to think about a lot of different things ahead of time. Okay, Lani, will turn it over to you now.
All right, and I'll just add, I'm going to add a link in the chat because we recently created a tool that expands on this list. It's called Overcoming Barriers to Participation. So we welcome you to download that for free. That page is full of free resources, so go for it. So I am going to talk to you about needs just quickly. So needs are often things that we observe in a meeting are like people's words, their expressions, their actions. They can usually find their way to a core human need. And trying to fulfill these needs is what each of us is doing all the time at this very moment. It doesn't stop. We're trying to fulfill needs that help us to survive and help us to thrive in this world. And we've really benefited from thinking about core human needs in our meetings and ways to address them. Not only in helping with equitable participation, but helping to get through maybe some difficult behavior. And so this is a great foundational tool that we wanted to share with you all. So these needs include physiological needs, right? Like air, food, water, shelter, all the things that we need to keep ourselves and our species alive. We've also got safety and security needs, like feeling protected from injury or financial scarcity, emotional security, and feeling at ease. And the feeling, the need that we need to feel that our society is generally stable, that we're not going to be in fear of war or constant harassment. Like these things matter a lot to our well-being. That there's order and certainty in the world. And you could even scale that down to a meeting. Is there order and certainty in this meeting? Can I navigate the dynamics in this meeting right now? And finally, we've got our psychological needs, like feeling included, or that we are respected by others, we're recognized, we're validated, we feel useful to a group or society. So no matter what the situation we're in, we are on constant alert for what we need. And when we get what we need, we tend to perform better. When we don't get what we need, we tend to perform poorly, engage with others or even ourselves in a more negative way. So it's safe to say that much of the populations that we planners are trying to reach, we've made a lot of strides in reaching them. We need to make more strides to connect with them. Like there are plenty of unmet needs in marginalized populations. So keeping that in mind in how we design our processes and how we facilitate. So wait a minute. I'm sorry, hold on just a second. Okay, here we go. I'm sorry, my screen went blank for a second. Okay, so there are a number of ways that unmet needs can show up in meetings, and this is the behaviors that you see on the outer side of this donut. They don't necessarily correlate directly with the need that's in the circle. It's just, discomfort can come from a number of things, from not feeling too hot in a room, or not feeling emotionally secure. Somebody could be dominating the conversation because they feel that they're not heard, or perhaps they don't feel that order and certainty in your meeting, so they feel the need to take over and change the agenda, something like that. It's all coming back to a need. So this can give you some just food for thought of where certain behaviors and emotions might be coming from. And I just want to say that, I'm not suggesting that we as planners are responsible for each person's ability to participate, because there's so much out there, right? We've already covered just how complex it can be. It almost seems like an impossible task. But what I am suggesting is that you consider these core human needs and what's within your sphere of influence to possibly address those needs. And many of those ideas we were just talking about, right? The pronouns, language access, timing, meals, childcare, economic harm offsets. I think what has been kind of an undertone throughout all of this is investment. There's so much that we need to invest in our time, in our budgets, to actually make these processes quality. And I think a number of you have experience with that. Like there's time, there's a lot of time that goes into doing this well. Like Joy was saying, 3 weeks ahead of time for translation. Have you budgeted the time to hire that person, to review that for yourself? Like, and we know that there's often a just this assumption that participation can be done on a dime, that people just need to hear the plan or the alternatives, or like, give them some focus groups or whatnot. And, our belief is we can't ethically underinvest on our participation processes in order to have quality plans for communities. So having a large enough facilitation team so participants can get the attention they need, or having a large enough planning team so that all of these considerations are considered. That's certainly where we're striving to go. And we look forward to working with you all in this profession to get there too. And we go to turning the table with Joy.
Okay, so this last concept, we're not going to have a lot of time to talk about by design. It's mostly food for thought. So we talked about what a diverse, inclusive group would look like. We've talked about what people might need for equitable access. We're suggesting that equitable processes where barriers to participation are eliminated and everyone has equitable access to the table, that's still not quite, like the ultimate goal or what's ultimately possible. So let's change the table a little bit. I don't know if you could tell, but like the picture in that graphic switched out. That's meant to be a round table now. With the idea being that empowered processes, so we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. I want to talk about empowerment too, because empowered processes meet the core needs of all the participants, right? So there's things like belonging and inclusion and validation and safety and security. And empowered processes give people access to creating the processes and to decision making, right? It's not just they come to our table. And so part of what I'd like you to think about is, what would it look like for us in our jobs? Sorry, that's not the image that I meant. What would it look like in our jobs if this was no longer, us just inviting other people to the processes that we've already thought about, but it was other people, people in our communities creating their own processes, their own agendas, figuring out what they needed in meetings and, sort of leading things on their own. That's, sort of the next step in this thinking, in, what transformational processes might actually look like. But I will stop there and I'll stop sharing screen so that we could spend the last couple of minutes seeing if any of you have any last thoughts or questions or reactions.
Well, a thought I had is, with that dominance phrase you had up there, and, in the community, whether it's a council meeting or a public open house or a neighborhood meeting, typically you get the same players to a certain extent participating. And so the challenge is, how do you get more diversity and inclusion? And then if people attend a meeting, there's that dominance of people that are more vocal and dominate the conversation. Mm-hmm. And the real key is for the facilitators to be aware that there's certain people in the room that are quiet, and there's reasons why they're quiet perhaps, and that, how do we get them to be heard and participate? So there's different levels of, that's part of that equity of making sure that everyone is at the table and
and participate.
Just plain, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I think of a story that I heard in Mexico. I was in Guanajuato and somebody was telling me about how the government tried to raise the fare to enter the city by 1 peso. And the community came in and they took over the fares and then they opened it up for everybody. So the government didn't get any fares for like a month. So when you talk about empowerment, that's something that has stuck with me is that story. It's like a totally different way of doing engagement.
I can hear my clock going off in the background, so it means we're at the top of the hour, and anybody that needs to leave, feel free to sign off. Thank you, Leilani, for sharing some of our resources in the chat. So it looks like our LinkedIn and Facebook and website are all there. Feel free to reach out to us. We love to just like chat with you, consult with you, work through a problem that you may be having. We're happy to be thinking partners on things. You are welcome. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your participation and best of luck in all of your efforts.
Yes, thank you all.